So welcome everyone to this new edition of The Lockdown, where I explore talent in lockdown. And this week, it's my pleasure to welcome my friend Lewis Garrad, who is a Brit who has been an expat in Singapore and Asia for some time, a fellow IO psychologist. You can never have too many industrial organizational psychologists together, especially when the topic du jour is to discuss things like the future of work, engagement, the interface between people and technology. So welcome, Lewis. It's great to see you today.
Yeah, hey Thomas, how are you? It's great to see you too.
Good, thank you. So let's start by describing or giving us a little recap of your lockdown experiences so far, where they have been, how long they have lasted, what have you learned about yourself and maybe the general state of humanity during this time?
Yeah, so I'm here in Singapore. So I've lived here for the last 8 years. And we've been in sort of an official lockdown now for a couple of months. It's been interesting. So, you know, what have I been doing? What have I learned about myself? I've been doing a lot of personal experiments. You know, you give a good opportunity to figure out what you look like with long hair. So I'm still on that one. I have a bet with my wife.
So that's still a lockdown haircut you're sporting there?
It is. Yeah, actually, yeah. I had kind of a morbid curiosity to figure out if I look ridiculous or if I'll pass for some sort of hipster surfer or something. And I can't wait to see what happens when I go back to the office and people see me like this. But yeah.
Do you feel kind of less corporate and more creative as the hair grows? Do you feel like your creative juices are being unleashed?
Absolutely. This is my opportunity to experiment. I've been doing that, like changing my routine as well, like doing different stuff at different times of day. So I'm fitter than I've been in actually, you'll love this. So I'm obsessed with data about myself. So I collect all this data. Now, run doesn't happen unless you have data about it. And so I know I'm fitter than I've been in years because I have the data to prove it. And I've sort of been moving my different activities in different parts of the day to see whether or not I sleep better, like I'm more focused, more creative. And it's funny what you can do if you have a bit more flexibility in your day. You don't have the commute, you don't have to be, you know, physically in places. You can start to experiment with stuff. So yeah, in some ways, I think a lot more creative and just willing to try things. It's been fun.
Yeah, I suppose the main difference for you, because you used to spend so much time traveling and on planes, is that, right? It must be the first time you spend so much time without going to airports and sitting in airplanes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I was traveling 300,000 kilometers a year for the last few years. I just, like, an ungodly amount of travel all over the world, Buenos Aires to Tokyo. And I saw a lot of amazing stuff, but I really am quite glad to be in the same place. Mm-hmm. So it's been interesting.
Yeah, and in the West, you know, when we look at how countries are coping or managing the pandemic, Singapore always stands out as an amazing example of, you know, it seems like you guys have it all figured out. What does it look like from within? You know, are these reports an accurate reflection? Is there more to the issue that meets the eye or the international media? How, you know, talk to a little bit about how the situation has been handled there.
Yeah, I mean, it's been from the inside, a very disciplined process, really, of just basically rolling out the measures that the government already had. You know, they developed a lot of really pretty sophisticated ways of dealing with this kind of problem from the SARS epidemic, you know, however long ago, I don't know how long ago it was. And on the inside, actually, it feels a little bit like what's the right way to say this? Very heavily policed. So, you know, it's a place that values order. The citizens do. There are ways of reporting people who aren't wearing masks. Those people end up on the internet and then they are reported to police. And I know people who've been given real warnings and those sorts of things. And there are real fines involved, some of them pretty significant. So it's been interesting. But the thing is, in Asia Pacific in general, I think you've seen a lot of discipline in the response to the pandemic. So you're now sort of starting to see the benefits of that. In Asia Pacific generally, we know New Zealand has been a tremendous success. They were very disciplined, but also places like Vietnam, Taiwan, and even China itself,
Yeah.
really what at the time seemed to take very strict measures and pretty, extreme measures, but have found them to be successful.
Yeah,
And
yeah. Vietnam,
so
Vietnam. I was reading the other day that it has, I think, 0 deaths, so pretty much 0 deaths. I think in a long time. It was like an incredible statistic.
yeah, they shut down borders really fast, put everyone in a lockdown, like in February or something, really early, kept them there for months, made loads of media around wash your hands, wear a mask. They just did everything that we've all done 6 weeks before everyone else did it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look back, you're like, oh, okay, I see, this is the benefit. And those statistics are still.
So this might be a little bit of a too philosophical question, but when the reports started coming here to the West on how Asian countries were handling this, the factors that were highlighted were there was a SARS, so it prepared people. You have more top-down or kind of active government interventions. You have high-tech countries. And you have, in some instances, an overly cautious and highly conscientious, almost a little bit paranoid kind of mindset, which I think, if I think about Singapore, it seems to meet all those requirements. But that's the leadership. Do you think there's also the element of the culture and the people? Because when people in the West say, okay, if we follow these things, it will work in the UK or the US or Argentina, I said, you also need to move the people that follow and are happy to kind of trust these measures. What is your sense of where the balance lies?
Yeah, so I do think the cultures in Asia have a personality. They are disciplined, more focused on, or more collective in terms of how they think about creating social order and the importance of that. And so I do think that, frankly, we have a lot of rules about rules.
Yeah.
And because of that, it makes it very easy to adopt new rules into the society very quickly. Singapore, I think, corners market on this. It's a really disciplined place. It's one of the reasons why such a tremendous economic success. Some people bemoan that it's not a very innovative place, or they have other concerns about it. I've heard it called sterile and stale, but they really know how to get stuff done as a community and as a country. And I think they've reaped the benefits from that as a society. I say I've been living here for nearly 10 years. And I think they're willing to try new technologies. And so, for example, the track and trace apps for contact tracing and everything, they were rolled out very quickly. People are very comfortable here to log in with their ID and log out. So the government knows where you are, what buildings you've been to, so they can trace very accurately and very quickly. So it's the combination of discipline and technology that I think has made this manageable from Singapore's perspective. And you see similar models in other countries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's change gears slightly and talk about how you see, the changes affecting the way people work. Is there a future for the office? Are we all moving virtual? I know you've been talking about the future of work for some time, you personally, and also Mercer, a lot of it. And I always felt before the pandemic, we should talk more about the present. It seems like now the future and the present blended into one thing. So what do you think are the main things that will happen to the way people work? And maybe what are the things that you hope should happen given, this crisis that always brings some opportunity?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think there are a lot of obvious things that we can say, right? That, work is, it's going to be more flexible, more digital, all of these other things. And I think that's been true for a long time. I mean, I think we're just being forced to adopt more of those practices now. But then I think there are some other interesting outcomes, like, for example, I was talking to someone today about being in the office. And she said to me, Lewis, I'd only really ever go to the office like a politician. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I needed to be seen and wave at people and, to be present, but I don't do any work there. Like, okay, that's an interesting point. She's like, who does work in the office? That's silly. You're there to be visible. And so she said, that's interesting. But so now I'm very productive. I was like, oh, interesting. And I think that's an important thing for us to bear in mind, that we used to use the office as social spaces. It's like the coffee houses of old. It's a place where politics is done. It's, who goes to the office to sit at their desk and work quietly? Otherwise, you could find a better space to do that. So I think one of the things that's going to happen is the whole social dynamic of the way work works is really going to shift. I was thinking if, you know, you're charismatic, entertaining, attention seekers can't be around their colleagues anymore, and your sort of quiet, introverted, more diligent people are sort of busy being productive at home, are we looking at a big shift now to sort of start to have to look at how people perform their work and really start measuring more on outcomes, you know, because in this environment, it's much more difficult to influence people and to play those kinds of games. And I think that will be one of the things I think starts to, you know, in management mindset, starts to get embedded down. We've been talking about using better people data for a while to make more informed, more objective decisions. Perhaps if this goes on for a while, we might be forced to.
Yeah,
so
and so that's a really interesting point, right? So it is a little bit, it sounds a little bit like the sterilization of work and making the average worker less Argentinian and more Singaporean in a way,
Yes.
right? So very kind of like charisma not so important. It's fine if you're introverted, also you do your job and we measure that. What does that do to engagement, right? How can managers still ensure that they are, you know, getting buying, conveying a sense of purpose and all the kind of emotional and sentimental stuff that we learned from the engagement literature in this world?
Yeah, so I think, so generally, actually, the data we've been gathering through this whole situation tells us that companies have, well, at least the ones we've collected data from, and just generally out in the market when we do research with employees just from a mix of different companies, people have responded really positively. Generally speaking, people think that their organization is doing a good job of this. They're actually more engaged, probably because all of a sudden, organizations have to step up and communicate much more frequently, higher quality. They put a lot more emphasis on the importance of effective people management. So there are all of these things that are kind of, you know, accelerating, I think, good engagement practices. How easy or difficult is it to communicate some sort of consistent culture if you can't get a group of people together and have them interact socially, serendipitously, and those sorts of things? I think that will we'll start to see some effects of that. We know that people who are joining organizations in the current environment find that really difficult. Like, imagine being a new hire right now, you know, you're trying to get to know people, you're trying to figure out what the sort of inside track is, who are the main sort of influencers you need to know in the workplace. It's just really difficult to get those signals. So I think that's been pretty tough and still will continue to be. That said, you know, for some people, I think that will be a benefit because they'll see a much more objective evaluation of their actual contribution. I think it's kind of interesting because if you think about the drivers of engagement, the things that keep people really committed, and we should talk about engagement as a concept, how it's involved, but like that whole component of meaning and purpose and, you know, or how do I find a story that makes sense for me? You know, a crisis is a great way to kind of start to kind of articulate messages far more clearly in a far more joined up fashion. And again, I don't think it's just the practices. I think many companies have also used this as an opportunity to really connect with that storyline and use the crisis to kind of heighten that. That said, you know, I don't think this is like the, you know, oh my God, this is a great thing for engagement, because at the end of the day, it's also going to cause huge economic challenges. And if you're a professional who can work very easily remotely, etc., then it's generally fine. But there are loads of people who this is going to affect really negatively and are going to find it very difficult to re-find work very quickly.
Yeah, so is the solution to offer, wherever possible, the flexibility and the choice? I also remember, by the way, a comment almost as good as the one of I have to go to the office to not work in politics, which is the reverse. Maybe a CEO that told me in the early days of the pandemic, we can't let people work from home. What if they like it so much they don't see the point of returning to the office, and they're, you know, because they're more productive and they're getting more stuff done? I said,
yeah.
So is the solution, you know, maybe one size does not fit all, and you have to tailor or personalize the shift and structure and, you know, mode of working to people's personal needs, psychological disposition, and maybe family and kind of circumstances?
Yeah, I think we'll just see a workplace having a very different function in our lives. Another example of this is I got into a conversation with someone in the office because, I was having my team can be quite loud. They actually talk to each other. And someone said to me, you're disturbing other people. I said, well, there are 300 people on this floor. So obviously before the pandemic, it's a public space. I don't see why we're going to be quiet in the public space and noisy in the private space. It should be the other way around. And I think that's where this will go. We'll see offices as meeting places, as spaces to be social, to interact, to maybe collect ideas. And maybe increasingly we'll see our homes as the predominant place where we will do the kind of work that is focused and deep.
Yeah, it reminds me there's this famous Aristoteles Onassis quote that says great businessmen discuss work during golf and golf during work, right? So it's like this is switching over. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about engagement. And let me start with the question that I'm really interested in asking you, which is, as a field that has become so big and as a construct that everyone or most people, maybe Rob Briner aside, seem to love and celebrate and glorify, what annoys you about maybe the way that it's misunderstood, trivialized, or bastardized in applications, right? As somebody who's trying to make the area more science-based and evidence-based, what are the frustrations where you say this is not what engagement means, and if only people learned this?
Well, so I'm going to use an analogy. So I think a really good analogy for engagement is health and well-being, like personal health and well-being. And the reason I think that is because if you sort of think about the way that we as individuals and society has changed the way that we think about health and well-being over the last 30 or 40 years, when people started caring about their certainly their physical health, the thing that seemed to capture people most was their weight. So like the body mass index is kind of the sort of first kind of attempt at using a very crude measure to kind of understand how healthy you are, right? So, you go to the doctor, they give you a physical, and, your BMI would be the thing that you would really need to manage. And, from that obsession, a lot of really bad things happened. People became obsessed with their weight. They kind of misunderstood. They thought that lower weight was always better, all these sorts of things. And huge industries developed around managing your weight, right? Weight, like foods and exercise
Weight
routines.
Watchers, controlling fat, or or like cholesterol, whatever.
Exactly. Now, we know today, and I guess we did know then, but no one really cared, that, for many people, there's an optimal weight, and it's kind of based on your genetics, like who you are. There's not like a perfect weight for humanity. It's very specific to you. Too low is bad, too high is bad. And frankly, not to just to belabor it, but the other point is that weight is a really crude measure of health. It's not the only thing that matters. And we've also begun to realize that actually physical health is also a really incomplete measure of well-being, of what actually makes someone successful and productive in their life. So the reason I use this analogy is because I think we've been through and are still going through a similar sort of transition with the concept around engagement. I think it really started off very similar to the way that we thought about weight. If I just have more, that will be better. I just need this to go as high as possible, and everything will be great. And that it's the only thing that matters. You see this obsession with engagement scores and metrics, and this is a very engaged organization, and completely overlooking the fact that people's relationship with their work and their company is really complex, and there are many dimensions to it that contribute to their effective performance. So, I think it was horribly oversimplified as a concept engagement. I think, like our obsession with weight as a part of the well-being movement, it had the right intentions and in the right sort of direction, but it's been far too crude, and it's still very crudely interpreted, I think, in many contexts. And in the same way that, you know, you wouldn't just measure your weight to find out that you're healthy and then, you know, I don't go running or eat differently. You know, there are many, many different things that influence that outcome and influence your overall health, and many goals to have. So I think, you know, the innovations in well-being and the better thinking that's coming into that space are really analogous to what we're seeing with engagement now, because you're now starting to see companies saying, wait, this thing on its own doesn't work. Like, we can have a good engagement score or whatever and still have a pretty poorly performing organization. Why is that? You know, you and I know we exchanged and wrote on this in the past, noted that, you know, maybe high levels of engagement aren't always that good, because you need some people, at least in the organization, to be frustrated or have a dissatisfaction with the status quo in order to challenge it, in order to improve. You know, that's where they draw their energy from. So if they like everything, why would they want it to be better?
Yeah.
So
is there a sense that some of this has come from you know, the positive psychology movement kind of hijacking engagement, and almost like the return to Maslow and self-actualization, and, you know, all employee and managers and leaders or organizations should care is for people to be happy, blah, 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 etc. Like, I notice actually a lot of pushback and anger when I tell people, at best, the correlation between engagement and performance, I mean, the overlap is 20% at best, if you really push it. So what about the 80% that isn't there? And they're like, no, 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 no. So would that be the equivalent, to use your analogy, of saying, don't worry about being healthy. If you keep your weight in check, you're fine, basically.
exactly. Yeah, that's exactly the equivalent. And it's deeply irritating, because if you really understand the detail behind, you realize that that's never going to be successful. And of course, people then use that as an excuse to say, well, none of this works. I shouldn't be doing this at all. And I think that's that's a step too far. That's the baby in the bathwater really getting chucked out together. I think the other thing, Tomas, that's important is that, you know, understanding organizations is really about looking at them as communities, as groups. And when we sort of assess attitudes in organizations, and basically we're trying to understand people's experiences. You ask them a bunch of questions, and, you know, the way that organizations then sort of oversimplify and narrow those things down into sort of meaningless statistics that then don't create any sort of change in the organization, also then makes you kind of go, well, what was the point in this in the first place? So, you know, I think that we've sort of semi oversimplified some of the important concepts and missed our opportunity to really learn about, you know, people's real experience.
Yeah, having said that, there are some common factors that appear in managers or leaders who disengage a lot, and in cultures that are responsible for driving low levels of engagement. Why don't you summarize some of those factors? That is like almost like this Freudian way of learning from the worst possible case, and then if you reverse it, you could avoid that. So what makes a leader disengaging or having bad effects on their teams, and what about at the cultural level?
Yeah, so first and foremost, the thing that gets people riled up more than anything is a feeling that things are unfair. And so any sort of lack of organization, justice, and, you know, people really have this strong need to feel respected. So, you know, of course, what ends up happening in many organizations, particularly for people who get promoted into leadership roles, one of the things they feel they have to do is to prove that they're smarter than everyone else, so that they, you know, feel justified to have the leadership position. And so one of the really effective ways that leaders and managers disengage their people is by making them feel stupid. Because, listen, I'm smarter than you, that's why I'm in charge, and you should just do what I say. And, you know, that's a really effective way to very quickly disengage people, make them feel that you don't care about them. And the same is true of having favorites and, you know, playing politics and having an in-group and a clear out-group. All of these things, very, very quickly, people pick up on that culture, and it's very disengaging. The other thing then is not managing, as I say, the organization as a community. You know, organizations are groups. People want to feel a sense of belonging to that group, have a shared identity with it. And so if you don't pay attention to that and you sort of break people off and play them against each other, then, you know, it's a really dangerous tactic that, you know, sure could get some internal competition going, but, you know, goes against the core need that people have to feel that we're in this together. Of course, you know, as Harari says, the most effective thing that we do is collaborate. And when we can do amazing things. And so leaders that don't help people feel that sense of belonging and miss that opportunity, disengage. And the last thing is that they fail to help, leaders who fail to help people feel really recognized and appreciated, to feel a sense of achievement, that they're doing something worth doing, both for them personally and very often for other people. They create highly disengaged organizations. What does that mean? Well, you know, if you break work down into individual chunks and just give it out like tasks, you micromanage, you know, people struggle to see the bigger picture, the overarching story, the bigger purpose. And we really need that, actually. That's a pretty deep human need. And across all of those things, I think it's interesting because individuals do engage differently. So we know personality predicts engagement, but at the, 50% of it. But at the end of the day, leaders manage groups. You know, their job is to bring a group of people together to create a high performing team or organization, right? And the sort of special value add that a leader has is on the interactions within the group, right? It's the kind of building that culture and that team climate. And I thought, you know, an interesting analogy of this is, I was listening to some research and reading up on the implicit association test recently and how that does or does not predict individual behavior. But what's interesting is I've stumbled upon another piece of research that shows it doesn't predict individual behavior very well, but it does predict community outcomes. So like the number of shootings of Black men in certain parts of the United States is predicted by the overall IAT results for that community, even if it's not taken by police officers. And I think
interesting, and which might be a matter of aggregating small differences at the aggregate to collective level have big impact, right?
Exactly. And I think that's often what we're doing when we're kind of looking at engagement. What you're doing is you're adding just enough to every individual that it adds up to make a really big impact for a team or an organization.
Yeah, so let me ask you about measuring engagement. And first, you know, I guess it's like, this seems to me like the most obvious question, but I don't see it asked very often, which is, do people realize if they are engaged or not? Can you be like asymptomatic, like with COVID-19, maybe you have the virus, but no symptoms. Do you wake up and you realize if you're engaged or not? Or otherwise, what's the best way for people to find out where they might be in the engagement spectrum?
Yeah, so the best way to know, so first of all, I don't think people care. I think that on a day-to-day experience level, they're not thinking about, am I engaged there or not? They might sort of recognize and appreciate their own energy levels. But, you know, as Kahneman has taught us, there's a difference between your experiencing self and your remembering self.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the experiencing self is important because it's connected to behavior. And the remembering self is much more generous. So let's separate the question. If you ask me, what do we measure? We measure people's sort of remembered experiences about their work. And so actually many organizations, I think, get a much rosier picture than perhaps they had even expected or even is true. And there are a few reasons for that. Like I said, people tend to remember things more positively, particularly when they are things about themselves, because they have to tell them a story just for their own mental self. They have to tell themselves a story that they're happy. This is like, you have to have a really bad experience on a vacation to remember it's bad because you want it to be good. And the same is true of your work. So if people want to know if they're engaged, they should look at their behavior and think about, well, how was I spending my time? You know, did I sneak off for a nap in the middle of the day because I really couldn't, you know, focus anymore and this wasn't something I wanted to do anymore? Or, you know, do I really get into a deep state of flow and, you know, have this really absorbed experience of what I do? And if you're doing more of the latter, then you're probably a more engaged person.
Yeah, and do you think it's feasible to expect a large proportion of the workforce to have that experience, that, you know, almost like customer-like experience at work, where they frequently are in a state of flow, time, you know, flies by, they wake up feeling a burst of energy every morning, et cetera, et cetera? Or are we creating a false sense of unrealistic expectations that, you know, I can see, especially before the crisis, that people are reading all this stuff about engagement and they're thinking, damn, my job sucks, I don't feel any of these things. And maybe they feel like they have to change careers or jobs, and actually they were okay.
Yeah. So, so I guess I think that we are creating an unrealistic expectation that everyone should love it all of the time. I mean, people are human beings at the end of the day, and they will have a different experience at different times as well of their life, depending on what their needs are. I do think there is a very positive movement in organizations right now to start to think of the employee experience a lot like engineers think of user experiences. Like, you know what a crappy user experience feels like. Like, oh my God, I will do anything to stop using this. And it's disengaging, it's frustrating, it's not intuitive. If I said, imagine that now for an organization, I think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I think my company is like that. You know, who does this? I don't know what to do. It feels everything you're doing, it's like the company is fighting against you. I think that's why the employee experience has become something that the HR teams and managers like the idea of, because it takes a user-centric point of view. And it's basically saying, how do I make it easier to get where you need to go as an individual, more productive? And, you know, this is ancient research, but Teresa Amabile, you know, the thing that people love in their work is progress. If they get to the end of the day and they're like, I got stuff done today, I moved forward, that's the thing that gets them out of bed excited the next day more than anything. So I think there's a positive movement, not just to trying to manage for happiness, but to actually manage for real experiences. That makes a difference.
Yeah. What about progress around measuring the construct or measuring engagement or even its drivers, right? Because 30, 40 years ago, you asked people on a 1 to 10 point scale, how satisfied are you with your job? I guess some of that is still relevant to engagement. Then we move to, you know, 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 questions, including, do you have a best friend at work, or can you bring your dog to the office? And now we're obviously seeing a lot of potential innovations, I guess, and some real innovations around passive measures, how many keystrokes you hit in a day, how many emails. Talk to me about how enthusiastic are you about some of these technological advances, and is there room for progress when it comes to measuring engagement?
Yeah, so I think some of the new innovations have been really productive. I mean, let's put it this way. There are some things that when it comes to understanding people's experiences at work, which obviously is then the thing you're really interested in order to understand what drives engagement, you have to ask them. So actually, the more forward-thinking organizations have got a lot more thoughtful about what am I asking and when, how often, at what times. So they've started to match up the timing element with the right question and the right experience and trying to tie all of those things together. That's a positive innovation. Seems simple, but you know, catching a person when something's actually happening to them and asking them what that was like, in a way they probably wouldn't articulate through whatever emails they send afterwards or whatever. I think that's a positive move forward to try to really start to see what matters. Onboarding experiences, exit, whatever. However, you know, then you get the move towards things like organization network analysis, where you've got lots of technologies now coming into the workplace that use your email behavior or behaviors of any sort of interaction with technologies, because we're all using tools now. Could be, you know, maybe even Zoom analyzing how you and I interact to figure out how engaged we are in this conversation. And I think there is a lot that they can add, that can add, but there's also a lot of noise in that data. There's lots of noise. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done to try to figure out what that is actually predictive of. Because I haven't seen that much good evidence that any of these sort of new data points are, let's say, even more predictive than a...
But how feasible or Black Mirror-esque is a scenario where you have a lot of managers, you know, having Zoom meetings or Microsoft Teams, Google Hangout, whatever, Blue Jeans meetings with their employees. And while they're having a conversation about their task, work, performance appraisal, an algorithm gives them a thermometer-like measure of this is how engaged Lewis is right now. And if that is the case, would you then say all the right words and make a lot of eye contact and move and smile to create that? I mean, in a way, it's no different from what happens in an analog employee appraisal situation where you have to show that you are happy and engaged, etc. So do you see this happening, or is it too noisy and too creepy?
No, I don't think it's too creepy, because I think it would improve the quality of interaction, and anything that supports that, I think, is good. I still think that people are too, it's overly simplistic to just use in the moment type data. I mean, if you and I had like a little gauge to like how engaging is this conversation, etc. Okay, maybe we'd pay attention to it and it might influence some of our behavior right here and now. But people collect experiences over time. This is what they sort of see things, and their career is an aggregate. It's a rich tapestry of many colors, as someone once said to me. And so when people, their engagement is a contribution of many, many different things. That's why I do think that I'd be interested to see where the sort of email analytics goes, because in some of the work we've done, it's not predictive of how engaged you are. It is very predictive of who gets promoted. It's very interesting, which, you could argue is maybe even more important. But
so if you send your boss more emails with the right words, etc., you're managing up and you're politicking and you get promoted. And if you're actually busy doing the work and not doing that, you're overlooked.
Exactly. And how far up your network, in the organization, your network goes is another one. And whether or not when you send a senior person an email, they email you back, all this stuff, right? So then there's an interesting question, is that would you want to know that? Like, would you as an individual want to know you are or are not engaged? I mean, that your boss knows, okay, but would you want to get an email from in your inbox that says, hey, I noticed you weren't doing so well recently. Do you want me to tell your boss, or perhaps consider doing this or that action? Could your email be a coach for you because it realizes that, hey, you're not very engaged? And then what would happen? I mean, the other thing that I think is important to recognize here is, imagine creating such a perfect workplace utopia that the person never wants to move on, right? Okay, wow. Then how much stagnation would we be creating in our economy, global or local economies? Because people just wouldn't change careers. They would be very static. How much responsibility would the organization have then to improve that person and give them new opportunities? Or would they run their course, fire them, and then they'd have to find another job? So, I think there's something to be said for people to outgrow their organizations, and for that to be a natural part of the way that we work. So I do worry, it's not so much about whether or not technology is interesting and useful. Is it actually helping us overall be a better community and a better economy by giving people opportunities to grow and to learn and to do better work? I'm not convinced it is.
I suppose the interesting question here is, because I like your analogy or your example of the feedback, right? So we are, and I know you do this more than I maybe, is on a daily basis, you monitor and you get a message from your Oura ring saying, take it easy, your heartbeat was too high last night, you're lacking sleep, don't push yourself. And, you don't presumably adjust your life to that entirely, but you take that as a signal, right? So for an employee to get a message saying, hey, the algorithms noticed in the last 5 days, you might be disengaged because your email pattern changed, you didn't respond quick, etc. And then not do you want us to tell your boss, but is there anything we can do to help? Or, that's the key, right? It's like you try to improve their self-management.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's important. This is kind of, I didn't say it very clearly earlier, but I think a lot of engagement is a group level phenomena and should be managed as such. And individuals will have different opinions and attitudes at different times in the year, different points in their life, etc. But on aggregate, how people experience their work tells you a lot about your organization culture. And just to sort of continue the analogy, So I think team or organization level feedback through these kinds of systems is very powerful for leaders to learn, and maybe for teams to learn about the kind of environment they create for people. And so if you ask me about where the innovations have been going, similar to well-being, like we all have our, wearables that give us feedback about the functioning of our bodies. And then maybe it says, like you say, I don't know, I'm obsessed with, fitness metrics. I might watch an elite runner's or cyclist's training routine, or get some feedback, like watch a video of somebody's diet routine and what they're eating, etc. And then I can change my own approach. And the same is true for what we learn from our employees, like what experiences are we creating? Then you can digitize and get advice in a very simple way and use that continuous feedback loop to just get better at managing them over time. And then for the individuals themselves, I think we should just recognize that they will want to contribute as part of the group, but at some level, there will always be people who will break off and split off, challenge that status quo, and that's a healthy component of human functioning, and we should encourage it. Like, I'm always suspicious if I see 100% favorable, positive feedback on anything, because I'm like, wow, either these people are all robots, or they're not thinking critically about the experience they had. So
yeah,
I think
it's the ideal future manager, somebody who has access to a lot of data, ethically collected data on the employee, and still provides the human or soft skill dimension to that data to provide a great, managerial experience and leadership experience. Do you see them being more data infused?
So I think, absolutely, yes. And in fact, back to where we started the conversation, I think this whole environment doubles down on that, because the sort of digital working that we're all in, it levels the playing field. We all have to connect in the same way. And so one of the things I do think is also a really interesting innovation is everything around managing interactions, particularly meetings. I think there's so much work that we could do on improving the quality of conversation in groups, in organizations, because interaction is where the action is. Like, that's really where decisions get made, work gets dished out, people's reputations get decided. And very often you just have one loudmouth and everyone else waiting for that person to shut up so that they can, say their idea, and then the meeting finishes. And I think that actually Zoom and our current situation has actually created more inclusive behavior, because even the quietest person has a channel, like through the chat, etc. So I do think that it would be cool if you could have like a real-time meeting feedback, and that if you were the leader of that group, you would get a rating of the quality of interaction that they were having, and turn taking.
And an algorithm that tells you time to shut up now.
Yes, like a warning bell, filibuster alert. Yeah, that's.
Hey, let's wrap this up and ask you the final question. As somebody who's had a successful career and still has a successful career in IO, psych, consulting, psychology, human capital, what would be your advice for people thinking of going into this area? Let's say university students that want to end up where you are today, or want to contemplate something that looks like a future career, professional career, commercial career in IO/management, consulting, psychology.
Yeah, well, so I would say, first of all, get a really solid grounding in data, frankly. I mean, I started a lot of my early career basically managing survey data, just looking at numbers, figuring out how to make sense and analyze them. And once you kind of understand the figures, you can tell stories from it. Those two skills basically support you for the rest of your life in many, many different ways. It's, actually, I think it was you that said this to me. There are two things that a psychologist sells: data and stories. Data about people and stories to understand that data. And I think, building skills in those two areas are incredibly important. I also think that reading widely and deeply about human nature is extremely important. So don't overlook the importance of philosophy and things like that in your development, in your reading, because that teaches you a lot about how people think about thinking, which I think helps you be a better psychologist, to collect better data about about real life, basically, which is basically what we do. So I think those things, there's foundational levels, and then be ambitious, focus on the work, you know, do good work, and find a place where you can be recognized for that.
Yeah. Do you think there will be more demand for, you know, well-trained IO psychologists in the future?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean, all of the statistics tell us that. And I think for an IO psych that can make sense of data and link it to real organization problems and tell stories from it, I think those people will be very much in demand. I noticed in the sort of skills needs, particularly in the Silicon Valley, one of the top kind of problem areas is communication, you know, just being able to explain your ideas, because you have so many people who are brilliant at the analysis and the AI engineering, etc. But to connect that to a real world problem and a normal conversation, you need to understand people and how they influence each other. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity.
Lewis, thank you so much for your time. I should let you go to sleep now so we don't upset the Aura gods and your other kind of data tracking. It's been a great pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Tomas.